Russia planned to assassinate the chief executive of German arms maker Rheinmetall, and the US and Germany had foiled their plot. That's according to reports from CNN and New York Times on Thursday. They say the plot to kill CEO Armin Paperga was one of a series of Russian government plans to assassinate industry executives across Europe who were supporting Ukraine's war effort. Rheinmetall had been producing artillery shells and vehicles for Ukraine. The reports say US intelligence first discovered the plot earlier this year. They told German security services, who were able to protect Paperga. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz declined to comment on the report when asked about it during a press conference at the NATO summit in Washington. While NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg did not respond directly, he did say Russia's intimidation tactics haven't worked.
I will not go into that specific report. What I can say is that we have seen a pattern, a Russian campaign organized by the security services to conduct hostile actions against NATO allies across the alliance. What we have seen over the last months is that NATO allies have not been intimidated. NATO allies are actually stepping up their support, delivering more aid to Ukraine.
Rheinmetall said in a statement that necessary measures are always taken in regular consultation with security authorities. Rheinmetall is one of the world's biggest producers of artillery and tank shells. It began ramping up production after Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Since then, it has set up a joint venture with a Ukrainian state-owned conglomerate to build and repair tanks in Ukraine, and also announced plans to open an ammunition factory in the war-torn country. The Russian embassy in Washington and the Kremlin did not comment on the report. A spokesperson for Germany's Interior Ministry said the government was generally taking the threats posed by Moscow very seriously.
U.S. President Joe Biden mixed up names and verbally stumbled at a press conference Thursday, one where he doubled down on staying in the race for the presidency and repeatedly emphasized that he was the most qualified to beat his Republican rival, Donald Trump.
I'm in this to complete the job I started.
Calls have tallied up by the day from the 81-year-old's Democratic colleagues to end his re-election bid over concerns about his age and mental acuity. His case may not have been helped early on in the hour-long Q&A when he mixed up the name of his Vice President Kamala Harris with Trump.
I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be Vice President, but I think she was not qualified to be President. So let's start there.
That came a few hours after Biden mistakenly referred to Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky as President Putin at the NATO summit in Washington.
Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. You can beat President Putin. President Zelensky.
Later, at the press conference, his first responses were garbled, but grew steadier as he fielded questions from reporters. He said he had undergone a neurological exam as recently as February, but would take another if recommended to him by his doctors.
I think I should have a neurological exam again. I'll do it. But no one's suggesting that to me now.
Biden has faced growing doubts from donors, supporters, and fellow Democrats since his poor debate performance against former President Trump 2 weeks ago. They fear he no longer has the ability to beat Trump in the November election or to lead the country for another 4-year term. So far, 16 Democrats in the House and 1 in the Senate have appealed publicly to the president to withdraw from the race. Officials from the United Auto Workers Union, which endorsed Biden in January, met on Thursday to discuss their concerns with his candidacy, according to 3 sources familiar with the matter. The union has a big presence in industrial states like Michigan that Biden will need to carry to win re-election. Biden has vowed to continue on, and his campaign argued that the debate has not dramatically shifted the race, even as it laid out a narrow path to re-election. The campaign argued it could win by focusing on battleground states Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. If Biden took those states, along with others considered to be reliably Democratic, he would win 270 electoral votes, the bare minimum needed to secure the presidency. The campaign characterized other battleground states he won in 2020 as, quote, not out of reach.
Kibbutz Be'eri was one of the worst hit Israeli communities in the devastating October 7th attack by Hamas gunmen from the Gaza Strip. More than 100 people were killed in the attack on the community of about 1,000 people, and 32 members were taken captive back to Gaza, 11 of whom are still believed held hostage. And on Thursday, the Israeli military published the findings of a first probe into its own security failings acknowledging it failed to protect the citizens of Be'eri. Israeli army spokesperson Daniel Hagari.
It is painful and difficult for me to say this. The Israeli Defense Forces should have defended the residents of Kibbutz Be'eri. But unfortunately, we were not there. For long hours of fighting, for hours, the residents of Be'eri defended their families with their bodies, alone, in front of the terrorists.
The investigation found Israel's military was unprepared for the scenario of a massive infiltration of militants into Israel, had inadequate forces in the area, and did not have a clear picture of the events until hours after the attack began. The rampage through Be'eri and other Israeli communities near the border with Gaza killed 1,200 people, according to Israeli tallies. It was Israel's deadliest day and the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust. The military presented its reports to Be'eri's residents, many of whom were relocated across the country to a resort beside the Dead Sea. Amit Solvay is Kibbutz Be'eri's chairman.
We didn't get an answer because they don't have an answer. They did an investigation, and the conclusion of this investigation, this is what supposed to calm me down in the future. But we didn't get the answer why the army didn't come in a minute.
Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant on Thursday called for a state inquiry into the security failings of the October 7th attack. He said the probe should investigate Gallant himself and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Gallant spoke at a military graduation ceremony with Netanyahu present. Netanyahu has dismissed past calls to form a state inquiry. Palestinians from Gaza City are once again on the move after Israeli forces demanded they evacuate amid an intense military assault. They are fleeing by any means they can, on foot, in the back of trucks. Mona Al-Husseini and her family have a horse-drawn cart. She spoke to Reuters in Al-Nusayrat, south of Gaza City.
We've witnessed a lot. Many soldiers stopped us and kept searching us and stopped us for an hour. It's torture. We left the Haidar roundabout 3 days ago. We were besieged there. Many rockets were fired on us and we were wrecked. I can't even talk. Our situation is hard to describe or talk about.
The fighting has expanded even as Washington pushed for a peace deal between Israel and Hamas. Hamas says a heavy Israeli assault on Gaza City this week could wreck efforts to end the war, just as negotiations have entered the home stretch. Residents of Gaza City say this week's assault is comparable to the fiercest battle of the war. Gaza City was one of the first major targets in Israel's retaliatory operation after Hamas fighters rampaged through Israeli settlements on October 7th, killing 1,200 and taking more than 250 hostages, according to Israeli tallies. A week later, Palestinians began to flee the city after Israel called on residents to evacuate. By the end of 2023, an Israeli air and ground assault flattened what had been home to more than a quarter of the Gaza Strip's residents before the war. As Israeli forces moved south, residents who had fled began to return. Former Gaza City residents were joined by refugees from southern cities. But Israel says Hamas fighters returned as well, and residents such as Mona Al-Husseini are again displaced.
This situation is very, very bad. I didn't even want to leave or go to the south, but necessity dictates. They forced us out. They gathered and forced us out.
Israel's assault has killed more than 38,000, according to medical authorities in Gaza. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Thursday said he remained committed to the Gaza ceasefire framework being negotiated and accused the Palestinian Islamist group Hamas of making demands that contradict it.
Kenyan President William Ruto took the sword to his cabinet on Thursday. He dismissed everyone except his foreign minister after nationwide anti-government protests.
I have today decided to dismiss with immediate effect all the cabinet secretaries and attorney general of the Republic of Kenya, of the Cabinet of Kenya.
The youth-led protests, sparked by planned tax hikes, which Ruto has since abandoned, have created the biggest crisis of his 2-year presidency. At least 39 people were killed in clashes with the police, and some demonstrators briefly stormed Parliament last month before Ruto abandoned the new taxes.
I will immediately engage in extensive consultations across different sectors.
In a televised address, Ruto told the nation he was also dismissing the East African country's Attorney General, but said the Deputy President's office was not affected.
With the aim of setting up a broad-based government.
Last week, Ruto proposed spending cuts and additional borrowing in roughly equal measures to fill the nearly $2.7 billion budget hole caused by the withdrawal of the tax hike. Analysts say the rollback means Kenya is likely to miss International Monetary Fund targets, although the government does not have debts due.
Ukraine on Thursday called on NATO allies to lift restrictions on its use of long-range weapons against targets in Russia, saying that would be a game changer in its war against Moscow.
If we want to win, if we want to prevail, if we want to save our country and to defend it, we need to lift all the limitations.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was speaking at a joint news conference with the head of NATO, where he thanked the security alliance for their support, but urged speedy action as Russia's invasion nears 2.5 years. His request to end the weapons limits comes days after the White House reaffirmed limits on U.S.-supplied weapons, following a wave of Russian airstrikes, including a missile that struck a Kyiv children's hospital. Ukrainian forces are only allowed to use American weapons just inside Russia's border against targets supporting Russian military operations in Ukraine. Some other NATO members have given Kyiv the clearance to use their donated weapons to strike targets deep inside Russia. Zelensky's cabinet chief pointed out to a public forum on the last day of the NATO summit that Russian forces had no restrictions in their war efforts. Andriy Yermak said it was impossible to fight Russia unless allies dropped the limitations.
Enemy can directly attack to our civilians, children hospitals, schools, and we have these restrictions. I think that it will be really game changer, and I hope that our partners understand it and agree these decisions as soon as possible.
Also on Thursday, U.S. President Joe Biden said he and U.S. military and intelligence officials were making decisions on, quote, a day-to-day basis on how far they should go in.
Wir haben, wie Sie wissen, die Risiken durch kritische Komponenten der beiden Hersteller Huawei und ZTE in deutschen 5G-Mobilfunknetzen sehr genau geprüft. Wir müssen Sicherheitsrisiken verringern und anders als in der Vergangenheit einseitige Abhängigkeiten vermeiden. Wir müssen unabhängiger und krisenfester werden. Die heutigen Bedrohungslagen unterstreichen die Bedeutung einer sicheren und resilienten Telekommunikationsinfrastruktur, gerade auch mit Blick auf Gefahren durch Sabotage und Spionage.